So, there is no self. That's what we're here to talk about. And strangely, I know I was making a little joke about it earlier, but strangely silence is just as eloquent about this as anything we could say. In a way, it makes no difference. There is no self. There is just, I pause because I'm aware that whatever word I choose to put next is inadequate. So I might say there is just this, there is just whatever's happening. I could say there is just oneness, I could say there is just non-duality. I could also say there is just stillness and there is just silence. So in a way it makes no difference. If that silence gives rise to words, it's no difference. The silence and the words are the same thing. And if that stillness gives rise to movement, it still makes no difference. That stillness and that movement is the same thing. Perhaps it might be more entertaining when there are words. Not necessarily. It could be less entertaining, but it might be more entertaining when there are words. But it doesn't really make any difference to the spirit of what we're here for this afternoon. We sit here and talk, we sit here and move, we sit here in silence, we sit here in stillness. It makes no difference whatsoever, because it's all simply a manifestation of non-duality, whatever it is. Movement is simply stillness moving. It's no different. Noise is simply silence making a noise. There is nothing intelligent, intelligible, or coherent that we can say about non-duality anyway. But if we are going to attempt the hopeless task of describing it, and it is a hopeless task, if we're going to attempt the hopeless task of describing it, silence and stillness are about the only things that we can say. What can we say about non-duality? Silence and stillness. But non-duality is everything. So no matter how much noise there is, that is still simply silence manifesting. No matter how much movement there is, that's still stillness manifesting. Now this might seem like, I don't know whether it does, but it might seem like a kind of trivial and banal point, and you might be sitting there wondering, why is he talking about silence and noise being the same thing, stillness and movement being the same thing? But it's not trivial, it's not banal. This actually strikes at the very heart of what we're talking about. Because one of the problems with what we're talking about, one of the things people find most difficult about it, one of the reasons that some people come close to non-duality, hear about it, and then run away from it as fast as they can, is because this strikes right at the heart of everything that we might believe about spiritual paths, meditation, whatever we might have read about the philosophy of Advaita or the philosophy of non-duality. This strikes at the heart of every belief, every concept, every story we've ever come across. And believe me, this head here has got a lot of stories in it. I mean, for at least 3 decades, actually more than 3 decades, I could describe myself as, it's a bit of a pat term, but let me use the term spiritual seeker. So I've been with gurus, I've sat with gurus, I've been on Buddhist retreats, I've done all sorts of therapy, transpersonal therapies, I've meditated, etc. I've chanted, I've meditated to huge Tibetan gongs. I mean, we have a phrase in English, you name it, I've done it. That's not quite true. I haven't done everything. I was never, never done Zen, for example. you know, I did a lot. And I did it with a kind of good heart. You know, I did it with a full and good heart and with good intentions and with motivation. I sort of like, I feel like saying I paid my spiritual dues with honour. Now, if you talk to people who have had the appalling calamity in their life of having seen oneness, which is what we're here to talk about today, that terrible catastrophe of awakening or seeing or liberation or whatever it is we want to call it. You know, if they've been a spiritual seeker like I was, then in a way it is valid to call it a catastrophe, a calamity. Because here is somebody like me, you know, going along very happily, filling up my days, and it really does, it really filled my days. And it fills so many people's days. It's so satisfying, it's so lovely to all those years of feeling I was on a spiritual path. It was wonderful. For some of them I felt I was helping to save the world, usher in the new, you know, whatever the age of Aquarius, the new millennium, whatever the age of enlightenment. So lovely. And of course you meet lovely people. Oh God, the people I was very involved with a big international meditation guru group for about 3 years. You meet such lovely people. You know, it's very difficult to find anywhere where you can meet lovelier people and on a spiritual path. In fact, I would say the only place in my... I'm very old now. And I'm much older than I look. I'm not really 47. And I can say, you know, the only place I have ever met more lovely people than on the spiritual paths that I went was at non-duality meetings. The people I meet in non-duality meetings, you know, I hold non-duality meetings in London regularly, and I go to somebody else's meetings as well because I have a very important role in their life. I pour the tea at their meetings. And the people I meet there are absolutely lovely. They're wonderful. Very open, very kind, very open-hearted and loving. But we haven't got there yet. Let's go back to the spiritual paths. It's so wonderful. You know, it's so fulfilling. You meet lovely people. Maybe you shack up with one of them. I don't know if that term is instantly translatable into German. You meet lovely people. You might meet a lovely partner there, a lovely spiritual partner you can share your spiritual path with. It's great. You know, perhaps if it's a guru thing, maybe you set up a little centre in your house, invite people over, show videos of the guru, meditate together, have a little puja table, candles burning, photograph of the guru. I have a huge photograph of my guru on my walls, lovely, you know. Go off to exotic places, foreign places on retreats. The main thing it gives us, as well as all of this, of course, is meaning. Meaning to our lives. Oh, it gave so much meaning to my life. I have to say, by the way, there's something a bit weird about non-duality talks. They are so appallingly spontaneous. I had absolutely no idea I'd be talking about this when I sat down a few minutes ago. I don't know why this has come to me, but anyway, it seems to, I think it's going somewhere. We'll find out. So the main thing, meaning, purpose and activity and lovely people, you know, one of whom you might even marry or something like that, and you run a centre and you're devoted to the guru. It's absolutely marvellous. But the main thing it gives us, of course, the most important thing is meaning. It gives a meaning to life. You know, and most of us love a meaning. It makes it so much easier. So that kind of awful dead time in the morning between waking up and first cup of coffee. You know, that most difficult time of the day for some of us, possibly for many of us, between waking up and first cup of coffee. That's a very difficult time to get through. But meaning really helps. Really helps if what you're looking forward to is not just that first cup of coffee, but also maybe sitting down at the kitchen table and licking envelopes to do a mail out for the next retreat that your guru is running. I'm talking long before the days of the internet. You know, I'm going back, you know, I did my spiritual seeking in the sort of mid-19th century, and we didn't have the internet. And I know it's unbelievable, but we didn't. So one of the most important things is meaning. So there we are, going along, and we're in this happy relationship, and it's all wonderful. And then catastrophe strikes. Absolute catastrophe, absolute calamity. If, for one of those two people, there's awakening, and suddenly all of that collapses. It can just be in a split second. All of that can collapse. Everything that I just talked about. The sense of meaning, the sense that I'm on a spiritual path, the sense that I'm going somewhere, that this somewhere is meaningful, one of the really important things that I haven't mentioned yet, which kind of connects with the idea of meaning, is the sense, perhaps mostly the sense that I can do something about the main problem in my life. And in case you haven't guessed yet, of course, the main problem in my life, I used to be a lecturer for many years, and I feel at this time, moment I ought to pause and say, can anybody suggest what it is? But I won't do that. I will answer my own question. I must remember I'm not back in my college in a lecture room. Of course, the main problem in my life is me. And so maybe, how can I do something about the problem of me? Because that's what's fueling everything that I've been talking about up to now. That's been fueling whatever it might have been. The psychotherapy, the spiritual search, the going to America or India or France or wherever it might be to follow the guru, and on and on and on. What's been fueling that is, of course, the problem of me. And in one split second, that can all collapse, because what that split second reveals is that there is no me. And that's really the central point of what we're here to talk about this afternoon. So all those other things that I've been talking about, they all hang on. I don't know if you have this image in German, we have this image in England of hanging things on a coat hook. You have to have something to hang your ideas on and your activities on something. So that we could say the sense of me is the coat hook that all of that hangs on. And in that split second of seeing, a screw wrenches out of the plaster, the coat hook falls to the floor, taking with it to the floor everything that's hanging on it. Every belief system, every story, every imagining about a future that I feel that I am progressing towards, that all collapses when it's seen that there is nobody that any of that belongs to. That all only makes sense because it's attached to that one absolutely central idea, that there is somebody for whom that is all happening. And without the me, it all loses its meaning. It all becomes a kind of meaningless story. Now that's not to denigrate it, it's not to put it down. You know, meaningless stories can be very rich and very beautiful and very entertaining. But once it's seen that the central me is not there, so the meaning no longer applies, you're just left with a story. A fiction, if you like. A set of ideas. And they may be very lovely, they may be very romantic. I mean, I'm a spiritual romantic. I tended to, that's probably why I never went anywhere near Zen. Zen is far too austere for me. I kind of got involved with the sort of spiritual romantic parts, you know, love of the guru and bhakti and stuff like that. But once the me has gone, then all that's left is a story. And it might still be a very lovely story. It might be a very romantic story. It might be a very flowery story. But now it's seen as just a story. And that can have devastating consequences, and does sometimes have. Oh, aren't I being cheerful this afternoon? It can have devastating consequences for Now, it's very difficult to complete this sentence. I want to say for the person who's had that split second of seeing, but of course there isn't a person. That's why it's a difficult sentence to complete. For the one, I've used that very vague term, for the one that's left. Now, awakening doesn't have to happen like this, but it happens like this often enough to make it worth talking about. So there's a person going along, well, maybe happily, maybe miserably, who knows, but they're going along with something called their life that they might feel in charge of, or they might feel completely out of control with. It doesn't matter. They're going along happily with something called their life. You know, so there's time happening. You know, there's a memory of having started somewhere off in the past, and I'm going through this stuff called time. I sometimes liken time, humans and time, to fish and water. You know, time is the water in which a person swims. It's the stuff in which he swims. So there's a person going through their life, and there's a past there. So they've swum through this water called the past. You know, now it's the present, and there's something there called the future. More water out there to be explored called the future. And everything's going along perfectly satisfactorily. It might be going along with great happiness or deep misery. It doesn't matter. It's kind of going along satisfactorily. It's like the world and life and everything is behaving as we expect it to behave. You know, I'm a separate person. I live in something called the world. I have something called a life. I have a certain amount of control over that life. I have a certain amount of ability to make decisions and choices about it. I have something called responsibility for what I've done in the past. I have something called responsibility for what I might do in the future. It doesn't really matter whether I am tremendously smug and self-satisfied and I think, gosh, haven't I lived my life in a beautiful way up to now? Or I might be catastrophically breaking apart and depressed and despairing. Oh, I'm the worst person who's ever lived on the planet. It doesn't kind of, in a way, it doesn't matter. It all makes sense. You know, whether I'm miserable or happy, whether I'm depressed or ecstatic, it all makes sense. You know, it all makes perfect sense. It's a story. It's a bit like a film I might go to see at the cinema, a novel I might read. I had a beginning somewhere, I've swum through this stuff called time to the present moment. All sorts of things have happened. Some of them might have been out of my control, but basically, you know, I'm an active agent in the world. I can do things, I can act, I can make choices, I have responsibility, I have a past, I have a present, I have a future, I'm swimming towards the future, it's all very nice. Tonight, me and my beloved girlfriend are going to welcome 12 people into our house to play a video of our wonderful guru, and we have satsang every other Sunday, and it's all marvellous, and then, in a split second, all of that falls apart. All of it falls apart, it's all gone. Because in a split second, there can be that seeing, that realisation, that none of that applies. None of it's real. Because in that split second, it's seen that there is no central self. There is no one to whom any of that story belongs to, or who has ever done any of that story, or who has ever made a choice in their life, or who has ever had responsibility for anything that they have apparently done, because they have not done anything. Things have happened, like in a story, like on a cinema screen, like in the pages of a book, which, however convincing the novel may be, you know it's not real. So in a split second, all of that can collapse. And who knows where that might lead. Right? I've got satsang starting in 3 hours. You know, my girlfriend's in the satsang room, lovingly putting out the flowers and lighting the candles for our guru that we've been following together for 15 years. And suddenly this is all nonsense to me. It's nonsense. It's a story, it may be lovely, But all the meaning suddenly dropped out of it. So what do I say? So this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the possible collapse of every assumption that I had about myself up to that moment. Because all those assumptions, you need to listen very carefully about. I was going to say I might look as if I'm talking casually. I rather hope that I do look as if I'm talking casually, but I think I'm choosing my words very carefully as well. So the collapse of all the assumptions I had about myself up to that moment, none of them apply. Not because they're wrong, but because there's no self for them to apply to. So that's why even a split second of seeing the infinite, let's say, or even a split second of seeing the infinite can be so dramatic. Now sometimes when that happens, the one who's left afterwards tries to rebuild everything, and sometimes it just all falls apart. So that's really what we're here to talk about this afternoon. And if you can bear the journey without any trains tomorrow afternoon as well, the possibility of seeing, if you like, that everything that I think I've built my life on is, in a sense, unreal because I don't have a life. Because that central being simply doesn't exist. So we could say, well, what is here? If it's not what we assume is here, what most of us assume is here, a person, an autonomous person, with a past, with a future, with choices to make, with responsibility, with meaningful decisions to make, somebody who has, to some extent, created their life, and has feelings about how they've created their life, has feelings about how they've created their life well or how they've created their life badly. What we're here really to talk about is the possibility of all of that collapsing, and what's left when it does collapse. And what's left when it does collapse is, we might say, everything and nothing, which are in any case the same thing, just as noise and silence is the same thing, and just as stillness and movement are the same thing, so everything and nothing is the same thing. There is simply nothing. There is simply no thing out of which the appearance of everything arises. And what I might dream to be my separate and autonomous self up to that moment of its collapse is just a part of that everything and nothing. I mean, one way of putting this, one way I grope for to put this, is to say that there are simply apparent phenomena. What is there? What is there? What exists? Apparent phenomena. Apparent phenomena arise, the sound of a voice, the meaning that we attach to these words, a movement over there, you see, the colour of some particularly attractive slippers, red slippers, sensation, physical sensation, the feeling of cloth on fingertips, an awareness of the temperature in the room, leaves, branches moving slightly in the wind, beautiful blue sky, beautiful clouds above it, phenomena, dandelions in the grass, flowers waving in the wind. What is real? Just whatever phenomena are arising. That's what's real. So what about the sense of self? What about the sense of separation? What about the sense that I'm a person who does have autonomy, who does have responsibility, who can make choices, who perhaps has a meaning to their life, who perhaps has a destiny that they're moving towards? That is just another phenomenon. It has no more significance and no less significance than anything else. the leaves on the bush blow in the wind, a phenomenon. The sense that I am an autonomous person who can make a real choice about something which is meaningful in the world, a phenomenon. There's no difference. There's no difference in the two. The head moves and the hand moves. And eyes close, and maybe sleep is happening, maybe it isn't. And the head turns and looks at the window. And perhaps a thought comes up, this is rubbish, what I'm listening to. It's rubbish. Of course I'm an autonomous person. I can feel it. I can feel my sense of self-motivation and the fact that I can make intelligent choices in the world, and I am responsible for what I have done, and I will be responsible for what I do in the future. Just another phenomenon. Has no more meaning than the flowers waving in the wind, and it has no less meaning than the flowers waving in the wind. In that sense, you could say all phenomena are the same. So that's what can be revealed by even a split second of the seeing of the emptiness of everything. And as I say, what we're talking about here, the possibility, if you like, the possibility of seeing oneness, the possibility of the collapse of the sense of the person, it doesn't have to happen like that, but it happens like that often enough for it to be worth talking about. There are quite a lot of reports of it happening like that. And just to complete the picture of what can sometimes happen like that, we could say that that kind of seeing turns out to be incomplete. Turns out to be incomplete because the seeing that I'm talking about, the collapse of the sense of self, just for a very, well, there is no time, but we have to talk in these terms, so just for a very, very brief moment of time, it could even be a split second. And the seeing that there is only emptiness. This is empty and that is empty, and because they're both empty, they are the same thing. There is no separation between this and that. What that can be followed by, doesn't have to be, but what that can be followed by is, let's call it a further seeing, a further collapse of the sense of self, where what is then seen is everything I've just been talking about up to now, that this is empty and this is empty and they're the same thing. But very significantly, what can also be seen is that this and this, as well as being empty and as well as being the same thing, are also full. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that, if you like, no, I'll forget that phrase, I'll just leave it at that very, very simply. What I'm saying is that what we're talking about here, ultimately, it has to sound paradoxical, it has to sound like a kind of an ultimate paradox, but what we're talking about is seeing that this and this are both empty and full. And it's the seeing of the fullness in nothing and everything which seems to finally bring an end to the searching person, to the seeking person, to the person who feels dissatisfied in some way with life and so is looking for a way of making themselves feel okay. The seeing of the emptiness of everything doesn't usually do that. You know, when emptiness is seen, it can still leave dissatisfaction and despair. And the despair can be about a kind of there's still a desire for things to be different, but maybe there's a recognition that there is nothing that this can do to make things different, because this, after all, doesn't even exist. And what brings an end, a kind of final end to seeking, is the seeing that this is empty, it is empty, it is empty, but it's also full. And there are absolutely no words to describe the fullness of this. So different individuals seek for different words, and we all fail. All phrases are inadequate, but I tend to settle on the phrase unconditional love, which is useless, but it's no more useless than any of the other phrases. No, I prefer it to the alternative, so I'm going to stick with unconditional love. So what I'm essentially saying, I'm sitting here and I'm saying there is a seeking person usually, and there may be a collapse in that, and there may be a recognition of the emptiness of everything. And then there may be a further seeing, or it may all happen at the same time. There's no rules about this, absolutely no rules whatsoever, where there is the seeing, which is absolutely challenging for the mind, impossible for the mind. It's got to sound paradoxical that this is both empty and full. And we can't say what the fullness is, but if we want to say something, we might as well say unconditional love. And it's that seeing that seems to bring the final end to the seeking person, to the one who feels dissatisfied and feels that there is something that they can do about it. And the last thing I'll talk about is the listener may feel entitled to say, and then what? And the answer to that is, whatever happens. After that, anything. After that, no expectations. And it can be quite difficult, particularly for some of us, for our minds to get that, because particularly if, like me, you have a background of spiritual seeking, our minds can get so filled with such lovely stories, and they are lovely, beautiful stories. I used to love them. States of enlightenment, multiple levels of enlightenment, 35 levels of enlightenment maybe, who knows. So many stories in the guru traditions and all the other traditions, so many beautiful, magical stories. Unending bliss. Oh, as many Ferraris as we want, whatever it might be. In a way, this stuff's kind of easier for the mind which is completely innocent, for the mind that kind of wanders in off the street because really they've come to the wrong meeting. They thought they were going to, I don't know, a rock concert or something. Most of us who come to this, we do have stories, or many of us, we do have stories in our head about something called enlightenment, or even worse, about someone called an enlightened person, an enlightened being, an enlightened man, an enlightened woman, upon which, that's a hook upon which we can build many stories. When, as in actuality, what can we say about awakening, liberating, whatever we want to say, the seeing of emptiness and fullness? And then what? How can we answer that question? And then whatever happens. Things might get better, they might not. Things might get worse, they might not. Who knows what will arise after that, unless seeing liberation coincides with physical death. One thing we can guarantee is some things will arise. But as to the nature of what arises, we can say nothing, because there are no rules. We're talking about wild, untamed energy. The rules that we make up, the stories that we tell about that, they're all creations of the personal mind, and none of them apply. So there may be awakening or there may not be. There may be liberation or there may not be. And if there is, then what? Anything. Anything. No expectations. No promises. No threats either. Just whatever happens. All we can say is that whatever happens will be happening for no one. And it's dangerous to talk about differences, but if we are going to talk about differences, that's the difference. That's the only difference. The only difference is that what was happening before was happening for someone, and what is happening, sorry, I have to talk in these time terms even though they make no sense, and what is happening afterwards is happening for no one. That's it, that's the difference.
I mean, there are certainly phases for people, different people. There might be a phase of despair before this.
Absolutely, very common.
That's
I mentioned it briefly in passing. Yeah.
And that is even then, for example, you see something is happening with that person.
Well, despair, yes.
Yeah. But what you are talking about is more drastic. It's more radical than just...
Well, I'm going on past the despair to talk about, in the story of time, what might happen after that. There may be awakening, followed by despair, followed by, let's call it a full seeing, and then no more despair.
Did I get that right? There may be an awakening, and then after that, despair?
Often after awakening there's despair, yeah, because awakening, in the terms I'm using, the way it can often apparently happen is that there is a brief glimpse of freedom from the burden of self, and then the self comes back, often in full force, and that can then lead to despair, because the reason for that often is because in that brief seeing of the freedom from the burden of self, it's recognised that nothing that the false self ever thought it did could have any effect in freeing itself, because it's a false self. So up to that point there can be hope. And then often what happens is hope. This is what keeps me. This is what kept me following my guru, for example. Hope. Then split seconds of seeing the emptiness of everything, and then that's an end to hope. It's then recognised that nothing that this thought it could do can have any application to the dilemma that it is really in. And that's why I often say that despair is closer to what we're talking about here than hope. It's like, I sometimes say, as long as there's hope, there's no hope. And as long as there's hope, there's no possibility of seeing this. Right? When this is seen, that tends to put an end to hope. And there doesn't have to be, I'm not that much of a miserabilist, there doesn't have to be, but then there is quite often despair. So despair is much closer to seeing non-duality than hope is. By the way, also, the mind can be very, very tricky, and I just said, as long as there's hope, there's no hope. Well, the mind can get hold of that and say, okay, I've just got a practice now. My practice now is to practice being without hope, which is just a nonsense. It's just, that's the kind of trick the mind plays. The mind's always looking for something it can do. So, okay, if hope doesn't work, I'm going to try hopelessness. I'm going to deliberately get up in the morning. I'm going to delay having my first cup of coffee till noon, and then I can spend all morning sitting on my bed practicing hopelessness. So hopelessness can become another practice. Serious. I mean, I'm kind of half joking, but I'm also being serious. Hopeless. The mind is that tricky that hopelessness in itself can be if I hear an authoritative enough figure say this, I mean, it's probably not going to be happening, hopefully, it's not going to be happening in my audiences, but if there's an authoritative enough figure sitting in the chair here, one with a big beard, not a little tiny beard like this beard is spiritually meaningless. A beard, about like that, it takes on the kind of spiritual profundity, nice big guru's hat on, robes, a mala or two, some flowers, perhaps some incense, some chanting, some devotees sitting, of course, on the floor. You're all being very disrespectful to me because you're sitting on chairs. You should have guessed that. You should have come into this room and realised these chairs are a spiritual trick. They're set up there to sort out those of you who are not really very spiritually advanced. If you're really spiritually advanced, you just sat at the feet, very close to the holy feet, because that's where you get the Shakti from. The endless da, you know where this is going. So if somebody who has got a lot more gravitas than I have, I don't have much gravitas, if somebody's got a lot of gravitas and a big beard and a big hat, says what I just said about hopelessness, which they won't, by the way. They won't, because they'll be selling something different. But if they did say that about hopelessness, then the mind is quite tricky enough to turn that into a technique. And before you know it, there will be 30 different websites inviting you to do hopelessness meditations. I mean, it's not that far from... I mean, for example, I mean, I'm not knocking this because death is a big one for most of us. It's probably quite a bright idea to try and get some sort of handle on death, but I'm not kind of a million miles away from the Buddhist meditation on a corpse. So in saying that, I'm not denigrating that at all. I think actually that's a technique I have a certain respect for, actually. But, you know, I'm not... It's kind of vaguely in the same ballpark, isn't it? You get up every morning and you do a 3-hour hopelessness meditation, because hopelessness, you've heard from somebody with a very long beard, is closer to liberation than hope is. Hopelessness is closer than hope, so now we will practice hopelessness. And I am, after all, I am the one, and I do claim this, give me a certain amount of gravitas, I am the one that came up with the great mantra. Did you remember what the great mantra is? What is it? Can you remember it?
I remember, you can say it.
Hopeless, helpless, and meaningless.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily the mind that picks up on this. It's more this pseudo or false I.
Yeah, I know.
Is that the same? Are you? No. We have
to use language. I mean, obviously, at this point, since you've raised that, I'm now going to say, of course, there is no such thing as a mind. I'm just, you know, we have to communicate.
This I that wants hope.
It's the sense of the separate self,
yeah,
which seems to have a mind. And to all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter, you know. I mean, of course we can say there isn't really such a thing as the mind, but it's a kind of useful concept for talking about certain things. It's like we need a map of words and concepts to be able to communicate, and the mind is quite a good concept for talking about certain aspects of ourselves, but there isn't really a mind. In other words, there isn't really an entity, there isn't really a thing. You know, this is all process. Everything is process. So everything that we think of as belonging to the mind is really just a process. Process of feelings, thinking, sensation, etc. Yeah. And we kind of lost touch with your original point, which I think is a kind of very valid one, you know. Why can't we see more difference in people?
Yeah, and also there must be this, what you described seems to me like emptiness. You realize there is only emptiness.
And fullness.
Yes, but...
They go together.
Okay.
They cannot be separated. That, realizing there is emptiness, I can't talk in absolute terms, but I'm going to say that realizing there is emptiness does not usually bring about the final end of the sense of the person. It's the seeing that there is emptiness and fullness, and they're the same thing, that does that. That's really important. I can't explain why, I just know that it is.
To me, that's very interesting, that thought that as long as you only got in touch with that emptiness, you are still seeking. Or there may be a tendency.
Yeah, there's a tendency
to get a hold, because one was used to having some kind of something to hold on.
Yeah.
And even if it's some traumatized structures that may be even more louder after that.
Yeah. I mean, I can't explain it. I could explain it and I could rationalise it. It would just be ideas of meanings.
Yeah.
But what I can do is describe it. And I can't say this is always the case, but what I can say is it is often the case that the seeing of emptiness can be wonderful, believe me, it can be wonderful, because it seems to offer an end to all possible personal suffering. But the seeing of emptiness doesn't tend to last very long, it doesn't tend to last very long, and it tends to leave, at the very least, dissatisfaction, but often despair. I mean, I put myself into a position where I get a lot of communications about this. You know, I give talks, I've got a website, I've got some books, people can ring me up and talk to me. So I get a lot of communications from people, and talks, emails, phone calls and so forth. So this is very common. It's very common for there to be this kind of initial and brief opening, followed by a kind of collapse in all the beliefs and stories that were there before that, and because of that, a kind of plunge into despair, which is, by the way, by no means as unpleasant often as it might sound. That's something else I perhaps should have added, because we might think of this word despair as denoting something entirely negative. It doesn't at all. I've had somebody, I've quoted this before, years ago, I had somebody contact me and they said, you know, I'm in complete despair, and it's wonderful. Now, if that sounds a bit mad, just contemplate this, that at least in despair, relaxation can happen. Because if it's genuine despair, this has given up. This recognises there is nothing to be done. As long as this thinks there's something that can be done, it's not real despair, it's not genuine despair. If this thinks, oh, I can make this despair better by going to see my guru again, or meditating, or whatever it might be, or gardening, or whatever, as long as this is thinking that, it's not genuine despair. So if you really get a handle on what genuine despair is, at the very least it can be relaxing, because it's the recognition that there is genuinely, really, nothing to be done. Nothing this can do, nothing these can do, nothing to be done. And in that, relaxation can arise. So one of the things I say is hope is a very hard taskmaster. Hope is always driving you on. Hope is extremely tiring. As long as there's hope, there's always something you can be doing, could be doing, and should be doing. Get up off your lazy, fat arses and what? Do something. Go and see your guru for longer. Work harder, save more money, and then go and spend longer in Rishikesh. You've done a 6 months Zen retreat. I'm sorry, there's a year's retreat, Zen retreat coming up. Why haven't you done that? But whatever. So hope is a very, very, very savage master. It drives you on. You cannot relax as long as there's... I phrased that. I misspoke, as Hillary Clinton once said. There cannot be relaxation. Relaxation cannot arise as long as there's hope. In despair, relaxation can arise. And I have said this over and over and over again in London. I can't remember whether I said it many times in Germany or not. There is nothing which is anywhere near close to what we're talking about here, but if there were, it would be relaxation. Relaxation is the closest thing to what we're talking about here. I mean, I've already said there are no necessary implications of seeing liberation, but it's quite likely that at least some relaxation will arise. That is quite likely. Actually, it's very likely, but don't tell people in general about that, because it might give rise to hope. You don't want people having hope. So, this may or may not, I don't know how this sounds to you, it may or may not sound completely mad, but believe me, I've had a lot of people report that. I'm reporting that from myself, but I've also had a lot of people report it to me as well. Not quite so enthusiastically as this one that said, I'm in despair and it's wonderful, but certainly I've had a lot of people report that they're in despair, and despair's not half as bad as you think it might be, because there can be relaxation. There's an English Buddhist who's written a translation of an ancient Tibetan Buddhist text, which is almost completely impenetrable. I really don't recommend you read this Buddhist text, but he's written a really wonderful introduction to it. And at the end of it, he says, relaxation is the key to Buddhahood right now. Well, I wouldn't phrase it in exactly the same way because I don't tend to use terms like Buddhahood, but he is absolutely on the button there. And absolutely gets it. Relaxation. There is no key, but if there was a key, it would be relaxation. And there is nothing that is close to Buddhahood, and I wouldn't use that word Buddhahood, but if there was anything that was close to Buddhahood, it would be relaxation.
Richard, you're talking about hope, but there's another thing that's not hope, but it's fear, what drives one crazy. The fear, if you know you have no control about life or anything, and that's not hope that drives, it's fear.
Yeah. Discomfort can arise in the system for all sorts of other things. Hope is only one of them, indeed. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
And it's also fear that makes one seeking for help, or that the fear may go away. Yeah. Not hope for getting enlightenment, but...
Well, in a way, they're very, I mean, I don't want to get too clever about this, but in a way, they're very, very intermingled, because, of course, then it's a hope that I can be rid of this fear. So, in a sense, that's always a part of what's going on.
Oh, but if even hope...
Don't forget that, go on.
Yeah, if even hope for... if there's a point, there you know there's no hope to get rid of the fear.
Well, I'm tempted to kind of answer that question from a kind of therapeutic point of view, which is a little bit different to what we've been talking about. But, again, when the hope's gone and there's just the fear, from a therapeutic point of view, then there might be the possibility of simply sinking into that fear, experiencing it and embracing it, which from a therapeutic point of view would be a very good thing to do. But that's really all I can say about that. But I also want to add, by the way, let's not have any expectation that when this is seen in all its wondrous fullness and emptiness and etc., 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 let's not have any expectation that fear might reduce. It might, but it might not. It might get stronger. In fact, there's a good chance that if it's there, it will be stronger. Just like everything, there's a good chance it will be stronger. Because what we're talking about when we talk about not seeing non-duality, it's like the blinkers come off, the blindfolds come off, the veils come off, and everything tends to be, I could use the word richer. Now you might object to that, you might think, well, I don't want to have richer fear, thank you very much. But in a sense, everything, we could say, well, everything is just experienced in a richer way, or we could say more neutrally, more full on. And that includes everything. So I'm not talking about some blessed state here, which is beyond fear, beyond anger, beyond sorrow. And at this point, I always quote, let me just throw this in, I always quote, because I feel at this point, I feel the need to bring in an authority to back me up. If I had going back to earlier, if I had a bigger beard, I probably wouldn't need to bring in authorities, but as I don't, I feel I want to quote somebody else. So at this point, I always quote it, I think it was a Korean Zen master who said, no one knows sorrow like a Zen master. And if we're entranced with the kind of stories of blissful enlightenment, that's a very, very good anecdote to keep a hold of. I can't remember his name. It may come to me, but Korean Zen master. No one knows sorrow like a Zen master. Because the blinkers are off. Because whatever is there is likely to be there full force. Because the one thing, not the one thing, one of many things that the sense of self, the person, the mind, if you like, none of which really exists. So I know this is paradoxical, but one of the things that the mind or the person is very good at is anaesthetizing itself, damping down experience.
That was I'm thinking that maybe one tries to hide in the self.
Yeah. Yeah, very paradoxical, but it's a way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah. You could say, I mean, this is kind of getting so paradoxical that it might even come out the other end making sense. But, you know, you could say, you know, we hide from reality in the self.
Yeah.
It's as good a way of putting it as anything. We do, I mean, we construct, if you like, you know, the mind, the self, the person, the neurosis, the neurotics person, whatever you want to say, none of which exists except as a kind. We could say except as energy, but nothing exists except as energy. It's very, very good at constructing ways of protecting itself against the uncomfortable aspects of life. The problem, in other words, putting on filters. So I don't feel the anger so much, I don't feel the sadness so much, I don't feel the fear so much. All of these filters come at a price, and basically we could say there are two prices that I pay. Instead of feeling full-on fear for 5 minutes, I feel nervous or neurotic for 3 months. So that's one of the prices, is that we dampen the feeling down, but at the expense of prolonging it. So instead of 5 minutes of anger, we can probably all think of people who've never been angry in their life, but they've been annoyed for 15 years. They've never had an explosion of anger, but they've been they're permanently irritated. So that's one of the prices that we pay. And the other price we pay is that when we put these neurotic filters on, it dampens down everything. It does, you know, we put these neurotic filters on because we want to. Why shouldn't we? We want to avoid the anger, the fear, and the sadness, which is a perfectly intelligent thing to do. Of course it is. The problem is that if we filter down our feelings, we filter them all down. So in cutting ourselves off from anger, fear, and sadness, we also cut ourselves off from joy, bliss, happiness, whatever you want to call it. So if we're prepared to put up with, you know, those two little problems, which clearly many of us are, well, fine. That just means it's all right. It doesn't, you know, it's okay. We spend 25 years being irritable and never experiencing joy. Well, so what? This is where good therapy can help, of course. I mean, good therapy can't help with what we're talking about today, really, but good therapy can help us to take those filters off so that we can start to feel some joy again in our life. But of course, the cost of that, if you call it a cost, is we've also got to start feeling the sorrow and the fear and the anger and not making those our enemies. No, they're not our enemies. Maybe we have bought some spiritual story about a blessed state which only contains bliss, and perhaps it seems very attractive because there's no fear, there's no anger, and there's no sorrow. But if that feels attractive to us, it's only because we've made fear, anger, and sorrow into our enemies. They're not. They're just feelings. They come, they go, just like everything. They arise, they fall away. Just like everything else. Everything is a constant arising and falling away. Fear arises, falls away. Joy arises, falls away. Greek meals arise and fall away.
Richard, the structures that keep the eye together, is that, I mean, that's what I feel right now. There's a lot of those things falling away, structures. I don't know how else to put it other than things that sort of hold the story together or whatever. That brings despair in a sense. That brings sadness in this case, for me.
It can do, yeah. Can bring relief in itself as well. As people experience in good therapy. They can bring both, you know, a structure of the self in that sense can be seen through, can fall away, and it can bring despair and sadness followed by relief and even ecstasy. Yeah, yeah, it can do. Yeah. Yeah. The difference in a way between, well, there are several differences between what we're talking about here and therapy, but one of the difference, of course, is that with this it can all go in a moment, which can be a tremendous shock compared to therapy. Yeah.
When we talk about hope, is that something like a main basic strategy in our society? Is that something that we come into the world with, or is that something that is that we are filled up with somehow, or kind of?
I think it's certainly a basic strategy for most of us, isn't it? I don't know what to say to do we come into the world. Does the baby come into the world hoping for mother's milk? I don't know. But it's certainly something that develops pretty early on. And of course we live in a society which very much, we could say, very much encourages it ideologically, which perhaps makes things worse, harder to bear, I don't know.
That's what I was thinking when there's this saying in Germany, and maybe in England too, hope dies last, or something.
Yeah.
And it's always pushed in every film, movie.
Oh, we love it.
It's the thing that keeps you going.
Yeah.
Hey, you just need a bit more hope.
Yeah, because it's so much part of, you know, the story. You know, we are living in a story, and we love stories because we feel that the stories that we love in novels, cinema, things like that, you know, and the gossip about our friends, those are also stories. You know, we love these stories because they, I mean, in a way quite sensibly, because in a genuine way they can help us to understand what's going on in human relationships and stuff like that. But yeah, hope is very much kind of, it's all, you know, there is an epidemic of hope, isn't there? So for every kind of genuinely existential film that gets made, there are probably 300 films of hope that get made. Many a very, very good film has been destroyed by a hopeful ending. Because you've got to throw that in. I mean, I don't know, you probably know, and I can't remember, was it in the 19th century? There was a fashion, I think it was one particular playwright or producer who got hold of Shakespeare's tragedies and changed all the endings.
Oh, no, I never heard of
that. That is a really good example of what happened. So, you know, Hamlet kills Claudius at the end, and then probably, I'm not sure, probably marries Ophelia, who didn't drown after all, and rules Denmark. King Lear ends in almost the same way, except Cordelia, you know, he cuts Cordelia, his beloved daughter, down from having been hanged. So King Lear ends in almost exactly the same way, except Cordelia survives instead of dying, which means that King Lear doesn't have to die. So he goes on into a happy old age. Cordelia and her husband rule over the United Kingdom, and King Lear, you know, lives happily, you know, in the grandfather annex. Othello, I guess. Othello doesn't strangle Desdemona. I don't know what happens in Macbeth. I mean, this is real stuff. I'm not making. You may think I'm making this up. This probably sounds even more insane than what I've been talking about so far as I've known. But no, I'm not making this up. Somebody really did rewrite Shakespearean tragedy with happy endings. It shows how deep this is. Now, you have to have quite a dark existential soul like mine to realise that's not the way to go. You know, so as far as I'm concerned, it can only be great literature if it's tragic. If it has a happy ending, it can be very, very good literature, but it can never be great.
Yeah.
Not everybody agrees with me. See, that's why King Lear is a great play, but As You Like It is only a good play. I've completely lost the point now. I've got myself sidetracked onto an interest of mine. I used to teach English literature. Indulging myself now.
Yeah, hope and this I are very almost identical, I find. The I and hope.
Yeah, well, there are some eyes where it's not like that. Those are the existential eyes. For the existential eyes, it's despair and the I that are much more identical.
Okay.
Have you come across the saying, if you're not depressed, you're not paying attention?
Who's saying that?
I don't know. It's a well-known saying. I don't know. Well, it's not that well-known. It's a little bit more well-known now. I don't know. Obviously, there are some eyes for whom that resonates.
That means if you look at the world with clear eyes, you can only get depressed.
Well, that's what the saying. So that saying came from a particular character. I'm just pointing out that that character also exists. So I've already said, for every one existential film that Hollywood makes, it makes 100 films full of hope. But notice, nevertheless, that one existential film does have an audience. Mm. It's a different audience, probably, but it does have an audience. Mm. And in essence, in a way, it doesn't really make any difference whether the I is driven by hope or whether it's driven by despair. It's still an I. I can sit here and say despair is closer to what we're talking about here than hope is. But it's still an I. If it's an I experiencing it, it's an I experiencing it. It doesn't matter whether it's an ice cream or a banana sandwich. It doesn't matter whether it's hope or despair. If the I is in place, the I is in place. The I takes ownership of everything. It takes ownership of hope. It takes ownership of despair. It takes ownership of the banana sandwich and the ice cream. The I owns everything. The I is the possessor of everything. When the I is attracted to renunciation and takes the path of the monk, then the I owns renunciation. The I gives up the blogs and the Ferraris, and it fills up its bank account with renunciation instead. Makes no difference. And in either case, the I might drop away. Suddenly there's no one driving the Ferrari. The Ferrari is simply being driven. Suddenly there's no renunciant sitting in a monastery, there is just sitting in a monastery.
And the mind or the I cannot prevent either of the both ways.
I don't know if this image works, it's just popped into my head. So if you're looking in the mirror in the morning and you see your reflection in the mirror, what can that reflection do? Can the reflection decide to clean its teeth? No. I don't know if that works as an image, But that's kind of the I. In a way, the I has the same level of existence as your reflection in the mirror. Your reflection in the mirror appears to be a person. It even appears to be you. Your I appears to be a person. It even appears to be you. It has the same reality as the reflection in the mirror. The reflection in the mirror is a kind of illusion. Illusion in the genuine sense, not meaning it doesn't really exist, but meaning it appears to be something different to what it actually is. I mean, your reflection in the mirror appears to be a person, another person, your identical twin, you could say, but it isn't. So it's an illusion of personhood. The I is an illusion of personhood. It's not what it appears to be. You could say it exists, it genuinely exists as a set of phenomena, but it's not what it appears to be. It's not a separate central self to which those phenomena belong. You could say your I is simply the totality of every phenomenon you experience. What the person feels is there is every phenomenon that I experience, and then there's the me that experiences them. That's separation. That is duality. That is the essence of duality. Why do we say duality? Two things. You know, I mean, obviously there are millions, zillions of things. So why do we talk about just two things? Duality, because the two things of which we are speaking when we talk about duality, which is what most of us experience duality, the two things are the first thing, the one thing, every phenomenon that arises, and the other thing, the sense that they're arising from me. So that's the two things. To put it another way, there's the sense that there's me, and there's a separate world in which I move. So I spend my life moving around inside this thing called the world. That's duality. There's everything that arises plus me. And all we're talking about here, the only difference is a tiny, 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 wee little difference, but it's the only difference that matters, is the collapse of one of those two things. The sense that there is somebody separate from the phenomena for whom those phenomena are happening. And then after that, there's just the phenomena happening. That's all. And the phenomena that happen might be more pleasant than before or less pleasant than before. Might be happier than before or less happy than before. It has no relevance to what we're talking about. It's simply the collapse of the illusion that there is this duality, these two things, all the phenomena that are happening, and the sense that I am separate from that and they're happening for me. It's the end of that. Bang, that's over, and then there is simply whatever's happening, whatever phenomena are arising. No more sense that they're happening for someone. That's it, that's all we're talking about here. It's so simple and it's so impossible for the mind to grasp. The reason it's so impossible for the mind to grasp, the mind that doesn't really exist, is because from the moment the mind has become conscious at whatever age that is, a very young age, it has probably only experienced reality in that way. When I say conscious, I mean kind of like, I really mean self-conscious. I mean the baby nursing at the breast has a kind of consciousness, but as soon as the individual becomes self-conscious, whatever age that is, it's a very young age, probably everything from then on that will be experienced in that way. Like there's me, and there's this stuff out there happening. So there's always those two things going on. That's why it can be such a shock if after 20, 30, 40, 50 or even 90 years, the sense of one of those things suddenly collapses. So now there is just oneness going on, rather than two-ness going on. There's just stuff happening, rather than stuff happening to me. That's all we're talking about. Rather than stuff happening to me, the recognition that there is simply stuff happening. That's it. And essentially, the nature of the stuff happening, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, has no relevance at all to what we're talking about. And that's why this can seem so tricky to the mind, because the mind of the one who is separate says it's got to be to do with making this stuff better in some way. It's got to be to do about that. I'm unhappy, I have hope, I'm miserable some of the time. It's got to be about making the stuff that's happening better in some way. Maybe that's to do with making myself less neurotic through therapy. But it must be to do with that. It must be making some sort of adjustment so that what is experienced becomes more pleasant, happier, better in that sense. It's not. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just seeing that it's simply arising of its own accord, and it's not arising for anyone. Joy arises but for no one. Anger arises but for no one. A cup of tea arises but for no one. It's that simple.
It seems simple enough to understand.
Yeah, and yet understanding is no help.
No.
And that can be very frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
And that's this drawing always back to that, because you think with this understanding that perhaps at some point the thing will happen, that maybe understanding is an advantage.
No. The thing that happens has nothing to do with understanding.
Exactly.
That's why it can be such a shock. The one who's always experienced every phenomena from the position of this is a phenomena happening to me can have no insight or possibility of grasping even the slightest hint of that collapse. And yet when it collapses, it's blindingly obvious.
That's understandable too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. As concepts, it's understandable. This is one of the this is what may be one of the frustrating things about talking about this. Yeah.
Well, one tries to find parallels, like in my experience, when was a situation when I was shocked to see that so-and-so.
Yeah.
And then you think, there must be something like that. Okay, so you get a feeling for that.
No. Because that as well, whatever the shock, was experienced from that, it's more than an assumption, from that absolute certainty of separation. There's a terrible shock, which just happened to me.
Yeah.
Has no bearing on what we're talking about.
Although
what can I just add? Yeah, go on.
Sometimes it is maybe for a while, for a short moment, for no one. The shock.
Well, that's different. That's different. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
That's how.
But every this, for many of us, is very, very clever. And everything this can come up with, to think that it can imagine what we're talking about must be like, usually turns out to be a red herring. Yeah. Which again is why even a split second of seeing can be reported as such a shock. And yet at the same time, so kind of bleeding obvious. It's like, oh my God, of course, but also that absolute recognition that this mind could never have got there.
Mm-hmm.
And what can also happen, if we've kind of been, in a fairly conventional sense, a seeker, and we've read our books, we've read our philosophy, our Eastern philosophy particularly, we've puzzled over Zen stories, not getting anywhere with them perhaps. We've read very, very bizarre sentences in books that have been lovingly transcribed from what the gurus said and so forth and so on. There can also be that sudden recognition of, my God, so that's what that meant. So many things just suddenly become obvious that had been puzzled over up till then. That's what that Zen story meant. Of course, it's obvious, but it can't be obvious to the person, to the individual, to the separate one.
But what is it that is then finding the whole thing wonderful at the same time, miserable but wonderful? What is the part that is wonderful then?
Did I say at the same time? The reason I'm pausing, I'm just trying to remember, did I say at the same time?
No, I'm just saying to me, for me, that's the experience. There's experience.
Oh, for you?
Yes, there's an experience.
What is it? Let's find out. Oneness is finding that, which is just another way of saying, well, what actually happens is simply phenomena arise. So the feeling of wonderful, this is wonderful arises. The feeling, this is terrible arises. What is experiencing that actually is oneness. What seems to be experiencing it is maybe, I won't make assumptions, but maybe a person. And if that person drops, then the feeling of that this is wonderful may still arise. The feeling that this is terrible may still arise. But it will be recognised that they're not arising for anyone.
No, I'm just thinking of the fact that what you said, the frustration of trying to understand, and yet at the same time often the feeling of there's nothing better than sitting here listening to this.
Yeah, yeah.
This is kind of a paradox in itself.
Yes, yeah. It's a mystery. You're hooked. Many people, and I use the word advisedly, many people are hooked. I've never found anything intelligent to say about that whatsoever, apart from quoting what I think is a wonderful line from Ramana Maharshi, your head is in the tiger's mouth. Maybe you think that you came here out of something called your own volition or free will, because you were motivated by something. Or you thought you'd get something, or something like that. But all of that is just more ideas, which is simply the phenomenon arising. I love that saying of Ramana's. Your head, why are you here? Well, you're not here, of course, but if we're going to deal with that kind of statement, what could we say better than your head is in the tiger's mouth? What else could bring you to a place where the only possibility other than a cup of tea and a biscuit is that you are utterly destroyed, that your life comes to an end? What could possibly bring you to a place of execution? Apparently, voluntarily. You have come to a place of possible execution, apparently voluntarily, but not really voluntarily. You have come here because the tiger has dragged you here. Maybe. Maybe if you're sitting here, you wandered into the wrong meeting, but maybe if you're sitting here, your head is in the tiger's mouth. And if your head is in the tiger's mouth, it's possible that the tiger might bite your head off, which more than anything is what, paradoxically, we desire. We may not know that we desire it, but that's what we desire. But one of the things I like about, one of the things I like about that metaphor is obvious. It's the idea that the tiger can bite our head off. But the other thing I like it is because it expresses, it seems to me perfectly, that kind of irresistible and completely unexplainable energy that draws us, or maybe drags us, to a meeting as meaningless and as hopeless as this. What could drag us to a meeting as meaningless and hopeless as this, other than something as strong as a tiger? And that's what it can feel like.
It's total insanity.
Total insanity. Yeah. Yeah, why would you even let the tiger get, what were you thinking of, that you even let the tiger get that close to you, that it could get a good grip on your neck? But when the tiger's got your head in its mouth, you go where the tiger goes. You don't have any choice about it. Now, this is not a perfect metaphor, because there's still a you in there who is helpless. I'm not saying there is a you in there who's helpless. I'm saying there is no you in there. So the idea of helplessness or self-empowerment is irrelevant. So it's not a perfect metaphor, but it's a pretty damn good one. You know, if you feel yourself to be a self, a person still, you're pretty feeble and helpless compared to the tiger that's got your head in its mouth. You go where the tiger takes you, and the tiger has brought you here.
Just that sometimes it feels like a longer dragging around than for others.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem so fair.
No, there's nothing fair about it. Nothing fair. Fair belongs to the person. Fair belongs to our deep, deep, deep evolutionary past. Justice and fairness are kind of embedded deep, deep, deep within the squishy grey matter in our skull that's been developed. Fairness, justice has been developing for probably 50 million, 100 million years or more. Our monkey relatives have a sense of justice. Don't think you can escape from that. So one of the things, I mean, people have said this to me, you know, it's so unfair. It is, it's so unfair. Somebody who comes to my, I've said this before, I don't know, Jody, somebody who comes to my London meetings regularly once said, trying to get this, it's like trying to open a box where the key's locked inside, which was a lovely metaphor. And then a few minutes later he just said, it's so unfair. And it is. Yeah. Yeah. Somebody goes to talks on non-duality for 30 years and still the person's in control. Somebody else has never heard the term non-duality and is going up the escalator in Car d'Arvet in Berlin to buy a kettle, and suddenly there's no one there. They've done no spiritual searching, no philosophizing, nothing. Their life up to then has been filled entirely with football and beer, perhaps, who knows, perhaps. And suddenly there's no one there.
This is what is so absolutely great about it too, that there is no fairness in it. Because that's something human, or something still of this I that wants to come in. And the fact that it is so absurdly random and absolutely crazy and out of anything that this mind could possibly ever...
Absolutely.
So like even in the unfairness as you're sitting there brewing in it, it's kind of like a, well, even that is okay.
Yeah. So there's something about that maybe, you know, in Zen and in the kind of crazy wisdom tradition and so forth, very dangerous tradition, but nevertheless kind of appealing to some of us. Something in that, like, yeah, it's just mad, this stuff is just mad. We are here to talk about madness, Yeah, and the mind, oh God, I mean, the mind is so addicted to justice. As I say, on a very deep evolutionary level, it's not a question that we might think, oh, well, it's just been around for a few thousand years since we've been philosophizing. Justice, Christianity, Judaism, etc. No, it's really deep in us, that desire for justice. Monkeys have it.
But that's also a structure of this I that keeps it together. This
Structural?
Justice. This idea of fairness and justice is also...
Keeps what together?
This I, this structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because of course, you know, then when I see injustice, which, oh goodness me, I seem to be surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of examples every day. Then the I can get very involved, and it can, the usefulness, our sense of justice goes much, much deeper than an idea. You know, it is really deeply embedded in us. There is no way we could, you know, we can separate ourselves from it, but because it's so, so deep in us. But it's really convenient for the eye, because the eye can hang so many delicious stories on that hook. So many beautiful and delicious stories. You think of all those wonderful stories, fairy tales, folk stories, and mythologies where people get their comeuppance because they behaved unjustly. Oh, don't you love those? Oh, it's lovely. Look what happened to King Midas. Didn't he just deserve it? Gave his only daughter a hug and she turned to gold. Couldn't you just see that coming down the track? Isn't that delicious? So, you know, it's a very, very handy book for the mind to spin its stories around. I mean, you could say that sort of virtually every noble story of improvement, whether it's moral improvement, spiritual improvement, improvement for the planet, saving the planet, etc., 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 all, I can't say all, because as soon as I say all, somebody will think of an exception that I haven't thought of. But so many of those are hung on this one simple hook of justice. Those films that Hollywood makes, maybe the one existential one doesn't revolve around justice, but the 100 non-existential ones do. We all want to see the villain get his comeuppance. Monkeys want to see the villain get their comeuppance.
Throw coconuts.
You get two monkeys to perform the same task, and you give one of them a grape and the other one a slice of cucumber. The one who's been given the grape will refuse the grape and protest. Sense of justice. Even though it's being offered the grape, I mean, the one who's being offered the cucumber will obviously get absolutely bloody furious, there's no doubt about that, as would you and as would I. But the one who's being offered the grape will protest in anger because of their sense of injustice. It's a beautiful story to hang. Hang everything, hang all the other stories on. Why do we cheer when Hansel kicks the witch into the oven and roasts her alive? Because she deserves it. It's justice. Because she wanted to cook the children. She's got her comeuppance, or as some of us say, if we've been steeped in Eastern philosophy, her karma-uppance. She's got her karma-uppance. Her karma has caught up with her.
But the monkey doesn't have an eye, does it?
I'm not even going to go there. Not in the sense we're talking about it. It gets a bit dodgy with certain other primates because they seem, I mean, part of a very, very essential thing that seems to make us specifically human and goes with the sense of I is what they call a theory of mind. And it does start to look like some primates other than us have a theory of mind as well. So they're not as separate from us as we'd like to think. But I'm not going to go into the realms of do monkeys need non-duality to rid them of their eye. Yeah, it's not quite so clear-cut as it used to seem.
But I mean, a sense of justice is not necessarily something that's connected with an eye.
No, but the theory of mind, much more. No, I'm saying precisely it isn't. You know, it's something much deeper than that. It's so deep in us, in our evolutionary psyche. But the theory of mind, you could argue, is connected to an eye. Is it possible to have a theory of mind without some vestigial theory of eyes? You know what one of the most primary bits of evidence of a theory of mind is? It's the ability to tell lies. You can't tell lies if you don't have a theory of mind. Monkeys can tell lies. Certain species of monkeys can tell lies. It seems to indicate that they have a theory of mind. You know what a theory of mind means, very simply? It's the development of the sense that you may have a different perspective on life from me. That's a theory of mind. So I have developed a theory that you have a mind which can be different to mine. Without a theory of mind, there's no assumption that anybody else could perceive the world in any way differently from me. A theory of mind seems to develop in us by the age of about, I don't know, something like 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. Before that, we don't have a theory of mind either. Some monkeys can lie. In order to lie, you must be able to know that the other monkey sees the world from a different perspective to how this monkey sees the world.
Mm-hmm. And that is a kind of separation.
We could argue it. I don't really feel I want to go too much into this, but you could argue it. Yeah. So basically what happens is monkey goes for banana. Second monkey over here sees monkey going for banana and makes the cry, watch out, there's a lion. Oh, first monkey scoots off into the trees without banana. Second monkey scoops in and snatches banana. Right? Second monkey is obviously on some karmic path whereby in several million rebirths it will become, I don't know, the head of Google or something like that. It will become a billionaire ruler of the universe. Well, for that monkey to be able to do that, it has to understand theory of mind. It has to know that first monkey has a different perspective from second monkey. Watch out, there's a lion about. No, there isn't.
Yeah. Well, even crows know that.
Oh yeah, crows, of course.
They pretend to put it there, and then if they see that someone watches them, they put it somewhere else, and they just pretend to hide that thing there. Yeah,
no, there's no, some, not just crows, some species of birds seem to be highly intelligent, tool users, for example. There's some evidence that bears, when bears hibernate, they do stuff that you think, they've got to have a theory of mind. They obviously know that the hunter who's going to come looking for them while they're hibernating has a different perspective to the bear's perspective. Yeah, so who knows? Maybe we'll have non-duality bear speakers, non-duality crow speakers.
But
non-duality monkey speakers.
This thing with the injustice, I think there was also a few parables in the Bible that even made me angry as a young boy when I heard them. That,
go on.
Yeah, there was this, for example, this parable that everyone is invited the whole day into this garden, and it doesn't make a difference whether you come early or late. It's the same for everyone, and people got really angry about the story because what's the point then of working here if you get the same goodies in the end, even if you didn't work any.
It totally confronts all our normal expectations. It's interesting how that one is ignored. It's one of the most puzzling stories, isn't it? So the workers who were taken on at the beginning of the day, and then there's a worker taken on, let's say, 10 minutes before the end of the day, they're all paid the same amount of money. It seems to be a denial of karma, doesn't it? It's a denial of karma. Doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter whether you work hard and worship your God or laze around all day on your fat ass and drink vodka. It makes no difference. God still loves you. It's lovely. It's beautiful. In that way. It totally confronts our kind of horrible Judeo-Christian morality, which we're so steeped in. Even those of us who feel we are a million miles from it are still steeped in it and are likely not to recognise it as horrible. Our kind of nasty bourgeois sort of Judeo-Christianity. You get what you deserve. And that parable's wonderful. No, it says, You know, what's that? That's not got to do with God's love. I don't often talk in terms of God, but I will now. That's not got to do with God's love. Excuse me, do you think God's an accountant? Sitting there, you clock in at the beginning of your life and you clock out at the end, and then God goes through his ledger and rewards you, or your health. Well, clearly the churches think that. Of course they do. Religions think that, because the churches and religions are there to support power and morality and so forth. They don't have anything to do with God. It's a wonderful story, that is. I love it. You won't find me saying that about many things in the New Testament or the Old Testament, but that's a corker, that is. It's wonderful. So if you want God's love, which is simply another metaphor for what we're talking about, and I mean, if you have a certain kind of personality in history, if the seeing of oneness arises in all its fullness, then you'll probably talk about it in those terms. It doesn't matter. Probably talk about it in those terms of a religious revelation, a spiritual religious revelation, being bathed in God's love. So it's one, if you want to be enfolded and embraced in God's love, then sit around on your fat, lazy arses all day, or get up very early in the morning and work very hard. It won't make any difference. And one of the people, I don't usually quote other authors on non-duality because I want you to buy my books and not theirs, but I do occasionally quote this author who said, what should you do? Do what you like. Have a cup of tea, go for a walk. If you know someone who's awakened and you fancy hanging out with them, then hang out with them. It won't make any difference. Of course, the reason it won't make any difference, whether you do any of that, or whether you sit on your arse all day, or whether you work hard all day, is because there isn't anyone doing any of that. It's not you who's doing it. It's all just arising. Being lazy arises. Working very hard and very passionately arises. Different characters, different circumstances. Nobody in there doing anything. There's no one in there being lazy. There's no one in there working hard.